You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Harriet Tregoning, Director at NUMO, and Yonah Freemark, a Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute, to talk about their report charting out a next-generation, place-based federal transportation policy. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note with a cool stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. Still working on some new designs for scarves and some other cool merch, and looking forward to sharing those with you all soon when they're finished. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Well, Harriet Tregoning and Yonah Freemark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thanks for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell those who might not be familiar with you a little bit about yourselves? We'll start with Yonah and we'll go with Harriet.
Sure. My name is Yonah Freemark, and I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and I do research on transportation, housing, and land use policy.
Great. I'm Harriet Tregoning. I'm the Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance. We call it NUMO, also based in Washington, D.C., and I've had jobs doing all the things that Yonah is interested in: housing, transit, transportation, land use, and now running this transportation-focused nonprofit.
So Harriet, how did you get into this work in transportation policy? Like, what was your first memory of, I want to do something transportation related?
I was 13. I came to Washington, D.C. on a field trip, and I was really gobsmacked by Capitol Hill, not because it was where the Capitol was, but because there was a transit station there. There was a whole beautiful street filled with shops and restaurants right next to where people worked. And right next to all those shops were all of these houses. And I grew up in suburban St. Louis, and I thought, wow, this is a really great way to live. I'd love to live in Washington, D.C. someday. So here I am.
And there you are. And Yonah, what about you? What's your earliest policy memory? What's something that strikes you as kind of something that started your love of urban policy?
Well, I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, which is a increasingly vibrant place, but when I was growing up, it was pretty boring, I would say, in most parts. Not a great transit system, not very many walkable areas. But when I was 7, I actually had the opportunity to live in Paris for almost a year. And that was very important for shaping my views of the world and helping me understand, the way a city could be structured. And that ever since then, I've been interested in cities and trying to understand how to make them better.
We have French planners in common.
It's amazing what happens when you can go somewhere else, whether that's overseas or even a different city sometimes. And some people go to New York and they're like, wow, this is so much different than, or DC in Harriet's example. Well, let's talk about the report, charting out a next generation place-based federal transportation policy recommendations for more equitable, sustainable mobility. When did you all first get together to chat about what ended up turning into this report?
Well, let's see. I think, this report is part of a broader series of research initiatives at the Urban Institute on place-based policies. And we've been producing a number of reports on things like housing policy that are more typically thought of as potentially person-based than transportation is. But when it came to thinking about a transportation policy, I was really excited about the opportunity to broaden our scope and think about the experience of others as part of it. And so, I asked Harriet whether she would be willing to co-author this piece. I think that was back in sometime last year, if I remember correctly.
I think you're being very generous. I think you just asked me to look at your piece, and I had so many ideas about what else you could be saying that, yes, that it quickly kind of overtook us both, I'm afraid.
Okay, that might be right. I think what is interesting about Harriet's perspective is, as she said, she has this incredible background working across government agencies, at the city, state, and federal level, and has this great multidisciplinary perspective that really allows us to think about federal policy as something that has importance for these different levels of government. And that's something that we need to think about on all matters, on all policy matters.
I appreciate your saying that, Yonah. And I think that, the thing that governments don't do very well is kind of do that stitching together across agencies or across disciplines or across funding programs. And, no one sitting in a community being asked what their problems are, what their aspirations are, is ever going to point solely at a single sector or a single agency, as the source of the kind of help or the kind of remedy that they really want. It really cuts across all those things. And I think that, we get much better outcomes if we could have those conversations with communities about their needs and then stitch together with federal, state, and local funds the right kinds of investments that meet, the totality of those needs instead of creating a new problem with the solution, to a single issue like we often do in transportation.
So then who's this aimed at? Is this aimed at the federal government to change so that they're trickling down to the local policy level and regional policy level, state policy level? Or is it aimed at local policymakers trying to get the attention of federal policymakers?
Yes. And the biggest funding recipients of federal transportation funds are states. So let's not leave states out. So it's to basically say, what are the ways in which we can present the money, right? What are the criteria we can use in getting people to apply for the money that would get the very best projects? And because this is about the discretionary funds largely, what are the ways in which we might be able to pull the much bigger formula funds kind of into this sort of framework? So I think our audience is both all of the traditional grant recipients, but also a lot of the communities and entities where infrastructure investments could be transformative, but they don't necessarily know yet how to access federal in particular, but sometimes any of the opportunities to try to get funding for their communities.
Yeah, one thing that I think is really interesting about transportation policy in the US is that when you look at the funding sources for any big project, you're going to see inputs from many different levels of government, almost always. The federal government is almost definitely going to play a share in terms of what is going to be, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars of capital costs. But typically, state and city governments also play a role in making projects come to fruition. And that means that those are all points of leverage. When all these different governments have involvement in picking out what projects they want to fund and are going to fund, they can be thinking through what policies they want to be advancing as part of that project selection decision making. So I think the types of ideas we're promoting in this report should be applicable to all levels of government. And in fact, they have to be, because in some cases, there are regulations that different levels of government exert on one another that end up influencing decision making down the line, even if, for example, the federal government is not the primary source of funding.
Is that leverage a liability or a benefit, though? It seems like I could go both ways. What do you think about how governments are getting pulled in different directions? It also could be a negative, I imagine. So how do you make it a positive?
Well, I think that it is a negative when the federal government treats different types of transportation projects differently in terms of how much of a cost share they would pay. So that's been a long-term bias that has favored road building over, say, transit. But I do think that in a strange way, we don't have enough co-investors in projects, right? That even if the transportation agencies at the federal, state, and local level can get together and fund a project, a lot of transportation investments would be so much more effective if the land use agencies were involved. And if land use that would make a lot of the trips shorter and more efficient, if that was part of the formula, you'd have a lot more success in transportation. I think that's true if you also need housing investment near transit. That's something, Jeff, you're pretty familiar with, that should be a partner for every transit station that's ever built. You need housing partners. You need to prevent people from being priced out. It's absolutely foreseeable that land values are going to rise. So why isn't this part of how we do business, all the time?
And, I think, Harriet, one of the things that we tried to emphasize in our report is thinking about transportation beyond transportation. We can't think of investments in a new road, a new transit line, a new bike path, any of those things as existing independently of the world around them. They have effects on people's lives in both negative and positive ways. And unless we start thinking about those effects more seriously and start integrating the other actors who might be involved in influencing or being influenced by those effects, then we're going to continue the sort of less than ideal transportation system we have in the United States today. And so we really try to emphasize the fact that we should be thinking about planning for transportation with land use, planning for transportation while thinking about healthcare, planning for transportation while thinking about investments in affordable housing. These all need to go together in order to have the most functional outcome.
So how do you pull in those other actors, the healthcare sector, the housing sector, all of those other groups that have traditionally been left out of transportation planning decisions?
Well, in some ways, they may not be involved in the decisions about infrastructure, but they're paying the price, for not being heard in those decisions. So, for every appointment that someone can't get to see a doctor or to get urgent health care, there's a cost and a consequence, both to the person who can't reach that care, but also to the system itself that, reserved time for the doctor or the nurse and did a lot of other things to make that appointment possible. I think that major employers, they have a huge stake in how their employees get to their job sites. And, we certainly saw a very vivid demonstration of what can go wrong, during the pandemic, when a lot of the bus service that so many essential work, transit service, I should say, not just bus, that so many workers relied on to get to their jobs, became absent or sporadic, unreliable, and maybe risky, for those who were riding transit. And so I just think, as Yonah indicates, a lot more people have enormous stakes, especially in transportation infrastructure decisions, than they might fully realize. The one thing I would add to what Yonah said about outcomes and about the kinds of things that are affected, I think very fundamentally, transportation is access, right? We used to really value things that were kind of close together and convenient, but in the 20th century, we pretty much substituted automobility for proximity. The only thing we sort of forgot about is that not everyone has an automobile or can drive or wants to drive or can afford it. And that really leaves a whole bunch of people out of the economic opportunities that any region might have. So I think access is, bizarrely enough, something that our transportation system isn't really built to provide, especially not affordable access. It's become this thing that really caters to vehicles, their speed and their congestion, and is pretty much indifferent to people, especially if they're not in those vehicles.
There was a headline in the San Francisco Chronicle that really bothered me the other day. It said, we've been waiting for BRT for 27 years. How will it impact traffic? And I just have to kind of laugh at those, because it's like, who cares? Who cares what it's like to the car traffic? It matters
Right.
what it does for people traffic, which is speed up their trip. And I think that's kind of a frustrating way we've been looking at things for a really long time. And it's emblematic of that kind of struggle that we have to reframe the discussion.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental changes we need to see in all of our transportation planning at multiple levels of government is changing our mentality from wanting to maximize the movement of vehicles to wanting to maximize the access of people to destinations. Those are two fundamentally different understandings of the world, two fundamentally different ways of seeing the way we use the right-of-ways, the transportation right-of-ways that we have, and two different ways of choosing investments in front of us. That said, the changes that are necessary in planning and in our governmental systems to make that transition possible are huge. We need to totally alter the priorities that our state departments of transportation have. so that they're no longer thinking about maximizing roadway infrastructure to move as many cars as possible, no matter the impacts on the environment, no matter the impacts on traffic over the long term. We need to move them towards thinking about how can we analyze access to make sure that as many people as possible have access to all the destinations they need in their daily lives. And that's going to require much more than just our report, but a whole mode shift in our thinking.
Yonah, you put that really, really well. And I think that the only other thing I would really say about it is that it's not even that the access of people is kind of invisible to the system, but the transportation funding decisions now typically reward very bad planning. The less you do to coordinate transportation and land use, and the more colossal congestion you get, the easier it is for you to justify very large grants of federal dollars, to widen roads or alleviate congestion. But if you do things that really coordinate that transportation and land use, one of the things I did as the planning director of the District of Columbia, where we're landlocked, we accommodated, after 5 straight decades of population loss, more than 100,000 additional residents in the same footprint, just by adding a little density, especially along places served by transit. And shockingly, our mode split increased so that more than half of all trips were taken walk, bike, and transit. The number of vehicles per household fell, as did the number of households that had any vehicles at all. Almost 80% of households became households that had one or fewer vehicles. And that wasn't because we got a transportation grant to let us do that, right? To do that mode split or to have that much more efficient travel. It's because our land use changed and we had convenience in every neighborhood where destinations were available for people to walk to. So I feel like one of the things that we have to change is how we reward the things that really make transportation efficient and affordable, and not reward the decisions that make it costly and bad for the environment and extremely inaccessible to many people.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, so many communities throughout the United States, when they're thinking through what kind of new development they're going to allow in their communities, ask those new developments to do things like provide a minimum amount of parking as part of any new housing units or any new commercial space. They require them to pay for roadway infrastructure improvements, which often means adding an additional lane in front of the new project, adding a new traffic signal at the intersection that's nearby, creating new curb cuts through the sidewalks and bike lanes that might be in front of that building. All those things are supposedly about connecting, the impacts of a development on the transportation system, but have the perverse outcome of actually encouraging more traffic and worse outcomes in terms of accessibility. And that requires just a total shift in mentality, because what we should be doing is saying, if you're going to be investing in a big project that's going to be adding jobs and adding housing units, make sure that there's good alternatives to driving. Make sure the streets are places where you want to walk, want to bike, and take transit. And that's just a totally different way of thinking about the world in front of us.
Yeah, it's often about mitigation, but the mitigation is often worse than the other outcomes that you want.
Can I take issue with something Yonah said?
Yeah,
You talked
sure.
about alternative transportation, Yonah. My friend Sue Zielinski used to say that calling, transit, walking, and biking alternative transportation is like calling a woman an alternative man, right? That these are the naturalist, easiest things to do. And most of our trips are taken that way. And most of the trips that we take even by car are short enough that in many, many places we could take them walk, bike, or some kind of transit. But I'm mostly teasing you. I know your heart is always in the right place.
No issue taken. From my perspective, I don't have a car, so the car is certainly the alternative for me personally. So exactly. I completely agree.
It just shows, though, how hard it is to get away from these languages that people have set up over the many years. From, we're not supposed to say alternative transportation. We can say active transportation now. We're not supposed to say car accidents. We're supposed to say car crashes. Nowadays, I'm trying to get away from saying freeway and say highway. There's a lot of different languages that have been set up over time that it's hard to kind of break free from. It's really fascinating. I mean, we all get stuck in it, and it's funny.
It is totally true. And it does indicate that there is this kind of framing of this issue that really assumes that auto travel it's safe to make that assumption that everyone is always for every trip going to be going by auto, which isn't right.
Well, I like in the report that you all set out three pretty simple goals to approach, and you mentioned access. But reducing the cost of living, creating access to jobs and activities, and reducing pollution is what I kind of boiled it down to. How did you come up with these aspirations goals as kind of the three key parts to address?
I think the biggest breakthrough might have been the point that Yonah raised earlier, which is access, right? Which is that what is the point of transportation? You know, it's touted all over the country for lots of different things, usually associated with economic development, right? But really, the point of transportation is to connect people to the things they need on a daily basis. And I don't know of any place where we're actually measuring how well we're doing that, how affordable we've made that access, right? And how safe we've made that access. So I thought for me, that was the biggest thing. Of course, we're in a climate crisis. And of all the sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions in our country, transportation is now the largest, and it is the only one still growing, while all the other sectors are declining in their greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's a big part of it. And then the issue of who isn't being served. You know, a lot of the differences in generational wealth, the differences in where people are in terms of their family success, their ability to move to different jobs and to rise in income and in skill level, a lot of that is really dependent on what they're able to get to. And I think that means that there's a lot of inequity in terms of who is served and who can get to the things that are really essential for living a good life in the US.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's fascinating about these topics of affordability, access, and environmental sustainability is they're all very much related. You know, when we talk about increasing access to destinations and ensuring that we have connections between land use development and the transportation system, we're actually talking more generally about creating environments where the costs of transportation are lower because you're not having to travel as far to get to basic needs, and where your environmental impact is lower for the same reason. You know, fundamentally, we have a sort of consumption view of transportation right now, where somehow the more miles you travel, you are, you know, getting better outcomes when it comes to your transportation consumption. When in reality, I don't think people would want, if they could choose, to be traveling as many miles as possible in a day. But we've structured so much of our society around the idea that we have to travel so many miles, 30 miles a day or something, to get to basic needs. When if we developed our society in a different way, we could do it in many fewer miles. And I think the benefits for equity and sustainability would be large.
I'm curious how your work works to incorporate rural areas, small towns, suburbs, differing geographies. It's interesting to think about the difference between, say, what you can do in a city now and what you can do in a less urban context. I'm curious how you all have thought about that.
It makes me think about, you know, the beginning of any human settlements whatsoever, right? They started with maybe a crossroads market, right? Where people who were growing things or hunting things or making things came together to exchange items, exchange things for some kind of currency. And those exchanges happen at every scale of human development. So, you know, I think for rural areas, there are towns, you know, there are villages, there are goods and services in those places. And a lot of them are walkable. A lot of them could be more walkable. But those things in the most rural of communities still exist. And, you know, I think that making sure that people can get not just to their town centers, their village centers, but importantly, get to places nearby where there might be more choices of healthcare or where there are particular services that are not daily needs that people nevertheless need to access. I think the challenge in rural communities is how do you handle that inter-town, inter-village travel, and how do you do it with a population that might be aging or not able, in every case, to be driving themselves. So I think that is an area where we've seen some technological advances that make it a little bit easier for that kind of transportation service to be available on demand. But I think the same principles about what makes a neighborhood walkable apply to what makes a town or village convenient and pleasant to be in and affordable.
Yeah, and I think this is interestingly, the conditions faced by rural areas are similar to those of urban areas from the perspective of who's making decisions, which I think is an important supplement to this conversation. If state departments of transportation are making a majority of decisions related to transportation in the United States, they probably make 80% or more of the decisions in rural areas because they have a single-minded view of the world that the answer is to invest in roadways, to expand the highways that exist there. And the presumption in rural areas is even stronger. The idea is if it's a rural area, well, people are driving around to get place to place. I think the problem with this is that, first of all, obviously, it has the same negative environmental and social outcomes as it does in urban areas. But second of all, it doesn't address the fact that actually people have different points of view about what should be done. And one of the things that we emphasize in this report is that the process of planning, the process of coming to a collective vision of goals and opportunities for what we want to see in our transportation system has to involve more than the director of the state DOT talking to his or her engineers about what they want to do. It has to involve actual, real engagement with the communities that might be affected so that those communities are part of the decision-making process from the beginning. And that needs to be done in rural areas just as much as urban areas.
That was one of the solutions I thought that was really important in your report, was thinking about capacity building in other places besides the ones that have traditionally had the power because they have the budgets to do planning. And it seems like it's not just urban areas that this capacity building would include, but the rural and the suburban areas that maybe right now they can't afford to apply for a grant they might need because they just don't have the people power to actually, do the application, for example. And so I think that was a really powerful part of what you all were saying in the report, was this idea of capacity building for these other entities that might need a little bit more help.
I think we were really there speaking particularly to the federal government because this administration has a lot of the aspirations that our paper really kind of also tees up with respect to equity and structural racism, with respect to an economic recovery, with respect to a lower carbon footprint from the transportation sector, and that there are so many barriers to achieving, those objectives, especially if you're not really investing in these ideas about building both the capacity, even for the entities that traditionally get the funding. I wouldn't say they currently have the capacity to effectively partner with communities. That's just not how they typically do their work. But communities also need capacity. They need resources to do the things like you're talking about, Jeff, do planning, to engage other members of their community, to be able to think about what are the things that they want their community to have, what are the assets that already exist that they really want to feature and highlight, and how can infrastructure investments, serve those things, and who are the partners that they need to work with in order to get, the very best outcomes. So I think that involves, a lot more upfront work and engagement to think about those things, as opposed to the kind of engagement that's more typical. Here are 3 alignments. Tell us the one you hate the least. Great, thanks. See ya.
My favorite.
Yeah, I mean, Harriet, I was actually hoping you could talk a little bit. I hate to take over Jeff's role here, but I was hoping
go for it.
I was hoping you could talk about some of your thoughts on, what the experience from some of the Obama era initiatives to, generate cross-disciplinary grant programs. What were the experiences there, and how can we translate those into thinking about transportation programs today?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I was at HUD, where I ran community planning and development in the Obama administration. And one of the things that HUD did that most people don't know about is that they have a huge disaster recovery program. It's a subset of their community development block grant program. But in some years, the Congress gives HUD more money for this program than every other thing in HUD put together. And as we get more and more disasters, I think that's going to increasingly be the case. But most people post-disaster, they lovingly rebuild things as they were, exactly where they were. And we were seeing that kind of over and over again with this funding. Hurricane Superstorm Sandy caused a lot of damage, and there was a very robust response by Congress to that. But after 3 years post Sandy, there was still $1 billion left in the accounts that had to be allocated, and we couldn't put it out based on the damage assessments from 3 years ago, right? We didn't know what remained of the unmet need. So we basically said, why don't we do a competition? Because it's not just the states that were hit by Sandy. In order to get congressional appropriations, that disaster declaration, that appropriation covered 3 years, 2011 to 2013, and every presidentially declared disaster, which was 48 states. So our contest, if you will, our competition was eligible. 48 states could compete along with several territories and several individual local governments. And we basically said, we should be getting more out of our investments in resilience, in recovery. And people need to have a better understanding of what causes their risk, right? And what causes the negative impact when there is an extreme weather event. So we basically partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation, and we ran a series of resilience academies all across the country. We invited more than 24 agencies to help us write the notice of funding availability. And then they participated in the academies. They actually helped select winners in the competition. It was a really shock to me, a way of doing business that involved a lot of collaboration across sectors. But we also did this competition in 2 phases. So the first phase, you couldn't even bring a project. Because Jeff knows this. I mean, there's 20 or 30 years worth of capital projects sitting in every state and local budget. None of those projects conceived of with climate change in mind or with the notion of equitable access. So we wanted to break the cycle of just pulling out some old project, but instead really examine the needs of states and communities and seeing what kind of multiple benefits could they get out of an investment in a resilient recovery. What other resources could they bring? What other partners could they find? At the end of the day, after a 2-phase competition, we awarded the $1 billion across 13 communities. They brought $5 billion to match our $1 billion and 220 partnerships. And the really great thing was that plenty of places that never got any of our funding, ultimately, they went through this process, they found the money to implement their own projects. And they said they were enormously different projects than they would have otherwise been doing because they thought very differently about both the problem and who needed to be part of finding the solution. So that really has kind of inspired me to think the same, similarly about what we might be able to do with infrastructure funding that is now becoming available and how we might engage communities to come up with, really impactful solutions that maybe leverage many times the funding that the administration is putting out.
I was really inspired by that experience as well. And, one of the reasons why I found, working on this piece with Harriet to be really exciting, because I think that there is an opportunity here to think about transportation funding as this, strike of a match that's going to change the way we conceive of planning in our communities so that we see it as an opportunity to build partnerships that include people and organizations working across sectors, organizations and people who want to bring in money from multiple sources so that you can make the transportation project just one element of a broader conception of how you want your community to transform over time. And I think there's an opportunity here to see the federal government as the seed for that kind of change throughout the country.
Do you all think the MPOs are also a possible way to kind of coordinate this funding? I was recently chatting with Jenny Schutz and about her book, Fixer Upper, and in the book mentions that MPOs might be a better vessel for, say, LAHTC monies or CDBG monies to think about things regionally. Is that something that, including environmental, monies that might come from disaster relief, et cetera, is that a possible outcome? You all mentioned, MPO structure in the book. I'm curious if that might be something that came across your mind.
Jeff, are you eavesdropping on our conversations? Our most spirited discussions have been around MPOs. I sat on the board of our MPO, and as much as I love the MPO, it was certainly true that they never had direct land use controls. They were a pass-through for money that came from, the federal government. And And that even without, an actual requirement, there's just a lot of log rolling that happens on the MPO, that jurisdictions are reluctant to veto or vote against certain projects because they feel like when their project comes up, they don't want others to vote against it. So I think that in practice, it's difficult, but in theory, and maybe with some very specific reforms, there is a possibility of doing something different, because the advantages, they have a regional perspective. The housing market, the job market, pollution, all of these things are regional. It makes sense to solve those problems at the scale at which they're experienced, but they would definitely need to be able to exert a little bit more forceful views on what should and shouldn't get funded.
Yeah, I also have some experience at MPOs. I sat on the Transportation Committee of CMAP, the Chicago Region MPO, back in the mid 2010s. And I think that what Harriet says is right to a large degree. The existence of these agencies does not mean that they ultimately serve the regional interest, because for the most part, they are simply executing the priorities of their member jurisdictions or of the state governments. And that means that if the member jurisdictions have a list of projects, the MPO is going to sort of take them together, take a stapler, and stick them into one document to create the MPO's list of projects. That has been the historical role of MPOs for the most part. That said, I do think, perhaps I'm a little more optimistic than Harriet is about changes that might be beneficial in terms of getting MPOs to play a bigger role. I do think I am a strong believer in connections between political officials and outcomes. And one of the concerns I've always had about MPOs is that, for the most part, the people who are on MPO boards are not elected. They are representatives of other elected people. And I think that sort of disconnect makes MPOs less powerful than they could otherwise be. So I think there are opportunities to think of MPOs as political entities maybe in the future that might change and have a regional point of view that is politicized, that I think could be really positive. But we're probably a long way off from actually seeing that implemented in most regions.
Did you all catch the small line in the infrastructure bill about MPOs? MPOs are required to consider the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the metropolitan area when designating officials or representatives. I thought that was interesting.
Which, by the way, we do mention in our report the fact that unfortunately most MPOs have boards and voting structures that are very non-representative of the regions that they're supposed to be making decisions for. So it's nice to see the federal government talking about this, but unfortunately, there is no requirement in any federal rule or law right now that MPOs have to actually have a voting structure that is population proportional.
Is there something in the report that you all think has been overlooked? Is there something that you all haven't been able to talk about a lot, or something that feels like people don't really pay as much attention to it as maybe some of the other things? I know access is something that a lot of folks have been talking about recently, but are there any kind of hidden gems?
Well, I'll go first. I mean, the thing I would emphasize is this opportunity to think of transportation as a collaborative, multidisciplinary planning process. We've talked about that some on this podcast, but I think it is overlooked by most people because most people are thinking about, with the, a gleam in their eye, all the money coming out of the federal government. They're saying, oh, look, this could fund all the projects that I have on my list. But I think that what we're proposing is that before we can go funding projects, we need to be having collaborative conversations about what our goals are for our communities and how we can best get there. And I think that's a different perspective than the federal government is currently promoting, but I hope it's one that can sort of gain an influence over time.
As much as I'm excited about how much money is available, the ironic thing is a lot of the solutions that we're really proposing, that we're really promoting, don't cost a lot of money. Land use it costs very little compared to, a mile of new highway or an interchange. So in some ways, the fact that there's so much money tends to make people go towards solutions that are expensive. So I think that's terrible. And that, we'd like to create more of a sense of urgency about the importance and the need to really have land uses that are compatible with these transportation investments. I mean, that's even true for roads, right? But it's particularly true for transit, for walking and biking. So I think that's another area where the sheer size of the grants already puts kind of the smart things to do at a bit of a disadvantage.
We just had this major knockdown, drag-out fight over the infrastructure bill. There's still rumblings of a BBB in some form. It comes and goes based on Joe Manchin's whims every week. What's the energy like for reform after last year's work? I'm sure many feel like Infrastructure Week's over for the next 6 years or so.
See, some of these reforms, they don't necessarily have to all happen at the federal level. So you probably, that the state of Colorado has decided to kind of denominate their transportation performance system looking at greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's a big deal. Right next door, the state of Utah, is doing something that they've been doing for a while, but really very closely coordinating transportation and land use, even at the state level with the state DOT. And that's just not something that most places are doing. So the advantage, I think, of having the system, the kind of federalism we have in the United States, where there's the federal government and then there's the states that the Constitution recognizes and really not a lot else, is that every state has incredible autonomy, to deploy these grants of federal dollars in the ways that they see fit. So I think we have 50 or maybe 53 chances to influence those states and territories and the District of Columbia to look at their transportation systems differently and look to get a different set of outcomes that also speak to the issues that a lot of them care about, greater equity, lower carbon, more resilience, more affordability, more housing that's proximate and convenient to transportation. I think that regardless of political party, that those kinds of arguments are very compelling. So, Yonah and I have, 50 plus chances to also share our papers with those state governments in addition to, our hopes for the federal government.
I would also add that, not only do we have this separation of powers between states and the federal government, we also have separation of powers within the federal government. And so even if there's no progress on new legislation, there can be progress within the executive agencies to make sure that the competitive grants are as effective as possible in selecting projects, developing project development processes that are as effective as possible. And so, I have been watching the notice of funding opportunities coming out from the U.S. Department of Transportation for the RAISE grants and for the mega infra and rural grants. And what I have been really satisfied to see has been a focus in these requests for proposals on equity and sustainability and on thinking about transportation with land use in mind. And I'm hopeful that this will continue to be a theme in the administration, that we get to start to see some interesting projects being proposed and being funded by the federal government, but that it extends even more broadly and starts to be put into some of the regulations that the agencies are putting forward. So there are a lot of opportunities there.
Maybe someone's reading this paper.
Yeah, maybe so.
Well, that's the point, right? Is to put it out there so people can read it.
And talk about it on podcasts and all kinds of cool things.
One thing you mentioned, Yonah, is equity in terms of projects that we can create for people. But a lot of times, a lot of the inequities happen when things are taken away, cutting bus routes, cutting trolley bus lines for diesel buses, et cetera. What should be done about those instances where things are cut?
Well, I think that part of what we've seen through this pandemic is the idea that support for transit extends not just to capital, but also to operating. And a lot of cities and states have also been experimenting with lower fares or no fares for transit and seeing it increasingly as essential for getting workers that we all rely on, to jobs. I think that is hugely important. And I think that we'll see more of that kind of investment. But I also think it's important that everybody feels like they not just can ride transit, but they want to, whatever their income, whatever their circumstance. And from the work you've done over the years, Jeff, that in our country, there's a real premium that people are willing to pay for convenience, and for that access to be near transit, to be near places where they can easily reach their daily destinations. And, in a place that we both really like, Yonah mentioned Paris. There are many cities in the US and around the world where there's a lot of that convenience, but it's much more common. I was in Leipzig not that long ago, before the pandemic, but just immediately before. And there's so much transit there that there literally doesn't seem to be any price premium. It's so ubiquitous that isn't the reason, that isn't the thing that gives a piece of land additional value. Like, how wonderful would it be if our cities in the US had so much transportation choice, so many affordable options, that it didn't much affect the price of land, instead of how it is now, where it's a scarce luxury that quickly prices out the people who really need that access the most. We just need a lot more of it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that assessment. There's been a lot of, the closest parallel that I can think of is that there's a lot of concern in lower income communities that bike lanes or other sorts of transportation investments are going to gentrify their neighborhoods and, result in people being displaced from being able to live in those places. And my response is, everyone should have access to good forms of transportation. And once everyone has access to those good forms of transportation, we no longer have to be worried about these displacement effects because everyone has it. And I think that should be the baseline. Everybody has access to a roadway in front of their house. So why can't we expect the same for transit and for other options, not alternatives, but things like biking and walking?
Thank you, Yonah.
Good job, Yonah. Well, stepping back a bit, this is my last question. What do you want listeners around the country who might be practitioners, local leaders, regular folks, or advocates to take away or be thinking about what they could do to change some of the status quo?
I think that so many places across the country have started to make steps in this direction. But I do think that these projects start not with a project, right? They start with a conversation or a series of conversations with communities about needs. And I think that if you start having those conversations regularly, then when a funding opportunity arises, then you are just returning to that conversation to realize, an aspiration that the communities articulated, right? So I think that you really can't start early enough with having those conversations. And I don't think you should be pointing yourself at any one grant opportunity. You should have the conversation now in the places in your community that have the least access. And then, as ideas begin to form, partnerships begin to form about what might be possible, then you are ready to apply for funding, right? But it's not going to work when you get a 3-month notice, that this funding is going to be awarded, even a 6-month notice, maybe in some cases a year notice. It's not enough time to lay that groundwork. So I would say, this is a 5-year funding bill, right? Have those conversations now, and you'll be able to, catch the wave when your community is ready, when the trust has been built and you've got a robust set of partners that are going to guarantee good outcomes. And doing all of that just makes it much more likely that you'll successfully compete. So start now.
We're doing some work at Urban Institute with some folks in Rochester right now who are talking about removing another portion of this highway that they have in the middle of the city. They already removed part of it a few years ago, but they are talking about what it would look like for their community to change over time with the removal of this highway, which served historically as a huge barrier between people of different incomes and different races. And one of the things I've loved as a sort of onlooker as part of that conversation has been this interest in seeing this transportation investment as just one element of a broader way of thinking about the way the city is changing. It's about, are we sure that everybody in this community has access to affordable housing and in the places that give them access to jobs? Are we sure that people have access to parks where they can live and go to, with their kids in any time possible? Are we sure that there's the availability of social services, daycares, other schools in the neighborhood? These are all related to the conversation that comes up when you start thinking about transportation investments. And I think that, what Harriet said is right. We should be thinking about this all the time. Anytime we're making choices about how to spend public money, we have to be thinking about it from a broad perspective that includes not just transportation, but all these other aspects of life together.
Well, where can folks find the report charting out a next generation place-based federal transportation policy if they want to get a copy?
I think the best answer is the notes of this call, but
we'll put it in the show notes. It'll be in the show notes. If folks want to, go on their phone right away, I guess if you're on your phone, you can go to your podcatcher and go to the bottom and it'll be in the show notes. But
they can definitely find it at urban.org if they search.
You know how I found it was by typing Tregoning and Freemark into Google, and then it pops up.
That's a good way.
That's the way to do it.
That's the best way to go.
And those two names don't show up together very often. So there we go.
Maybe they should show up more.
Well, now there'll be at least one more place, thanks to you.
Well, Harriet and Yonah, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
We've loved talking. Thank you so much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.